Hello and welcome to the Spontaneous History Podcast, where we look at a different historical subject in each episode. Today we will be talking about Camp Rupert and the prisoners of war it housed during World War II. As Idahoans, most of us are familiar with the infamous Camp Minidoka that imprisoned our own Japanese American citizens, but most of us are unaware of our other major POW camp, that is, Camp Rupert, located in Paul, Idaho. Quick disclaimer. Despite a large population of the POWs in Camp Rupert being Italian soldiers, the resources I found while researching were all focused on German prisoners. Therefore, this episode will also contain a focus on that group. With that out of the way, let's cover some basic information first. Camp Rupert was a prisoner of war camp for German and Italian soldiers during World War II. More than 400,000 soldiers were captured and taken to the United States. In order to combat overcrowding, the government came up with the solution of POW camps. Almost every state had one except Vermont, North Dakota, and Nevada. These were the base camps, but there were smaller camps called branch camps throughout each state. Branch camps were smaller and more temporary, and they had the responsibility to report back to base camps such as Camp Rupert. To paraphrase Chapter 8 of The Other Idahoans, branch camps housed soldiers in tents and were seen as temporary. Camp Rupert, on the other hand, resembled a city. The majority of the labor men were doing at these camps was agricultural, because a large part of the majority of American men who were farmers were gone fighting the war. Now that we know a little more about the prisoner of war camps, let's talk more in depth about Rupert and its branch camps. There were 23 branch camps reporting back to Rupert, and there was an eventual total of 15,000 POWs held there. Branch camps were described as often having nothing more than a wire fence to keep the prisoners in. Stakes were low, and farmers prisoners worked for often became friends with the POWs. One such camp was located in Fruitland, Idaho, where there was only a total of 12 prisoners. Guards didn't often speak German. In fact, until the last POW left, there was a major shortage of German speakers among American guards. Instructions were often given to prisoners on how to work and live at Camp Rupert via flyers which contained both English and German text. Authority went one of two ways in these smaller camps. Most of the time, rules were ignored and prisoners were treated kindly. On occasion, American men in charge would make up their own rules or neglect the conditions their workers lived in. POWs mostly worked in agriculture, although many ended up working factory jobs and other kinds of hard labor. Camp Rupert was focused on agriculture. Soldiers were put to work farming potatoes and sugar beet and picking fruit. Many soldiers and ex-prisoners report having worked mostly with teenagers, Mexican workers, and Japanese workers. Both Mexican and Japanese workers were sought out during the war for the same reason POWs were. American men were gone and fighting the war. When teenage girls between the ages of 14 and 18 found out that fruit farms were in need of employees, many applied to take a little extra money home for their families. Despite having such diversity in working conditions, it was still hard labor, and expectations for POWs were unrealistic. They had no choice other than to meet their daily quota of fruit picked each day. Orchards were described as old and hard to pick, and it became impossible for men to fill out the 17 boxes, or about 850 pounds, they needed a day. If quotas were not met, soldiers were to sleep outside while stripped down to a single pair of shorts in the freezing cold September. Conditions in Camp Rupert were nice and preferable to POW camps from other countries. In fact, less than 1% of prisoners ever tried to escape from American camps. Werner Schultz, a prisoner at Camp Rupert, had been captured from his post in Africa and taken to Morocco, then taken to America. He compared the conditions in African POW camps to the American ones, saying, "We were in paradise. It was luxury compared to North Africa." Branch camps were the only ones with tents. Camps such as Rupert provided men with housing and a multitude of other buildings and facilities. Rupert had a total of 172 buildings, including barracks, mess halls, hospitals, churches, workshops, recreation halls, dental clinics, post offices, warehouses, and playing fields. All these buildings were not for nothing. Quickly, Rupert developed opportunities for POWs to participate in activities as a community. There were theater groups, orchestras, concert bands, sports teams, and more. Concerts were put on by POWs, and American citizens were invited as special guests. Food was another thing prisoners benefited from. At one point, cooks were instructed to prepare traditional dishes from Germany in order to reduce food waste in camps. The plan worked. The Geneva Conventions had a very strong influence on German POWs and the way they were treated on our land. The United States wanted to guarantee safety and the good treatment of our own troops in Axis power POW camps. Through the Geneva Conventions, they enforced rules regarding hygiene, work, housing, food, medical attention, and education. This is the reason POW workers were paid for their labor here. It was stated that they had to be paid minimum wage or the same amount as a working citizen. In order to prove that we were serious about these rules being put into place, the United States treated German prisoners exceptionally well. This was especially obvious when the war ended. Once the war ended in Europe, the quality of food and many other recreational opportunities went downhill or were taken away, and prisoners noticed the difference. There was no longer a pressure to treat the enemy as well as they had because our own troops were all coming home. The attitude surrounding German POWs was interesting. For the most part, the American people separated Nazism from the German people. POWs were often welcomed into American society, and after their release, many churches sponsored German refugees, helping them apply for citizenship. Between 1948 and 1960, about 360,000 Germans immigrated into the United States. Many made plans to return after the war, but ended up back in Germany or other Allied countries that took German POWs. Most POWs moved around throughout the war and did not stay in Camp Rupert until the war ended. Many were sent to English, French, or Russian prisoner of war camps. Russian camps were the most dreaded of all the Allied camps. However, this does not mean that Camp Rupert was empty by the time the war ended. When the war ended in Europe, prisoners were required to watch footage of the German concentration and death camps. Most either dismissed the actions shown to them or entered in a state of denial. Werner Schultz, who was referenced earlier, asked, "How could German people have done that?" As time went on, many German POWs across the nation came to terms with the horrific news and decided to take action by burning their uniforms or raising money for their victims back at home. However, this was not common practice at all camps. Now, before we end our episode by discussing the ethical dilemmas surrounding Camp Rupert and my experience researching it, we have an interview with Fritz Graf, an ex-prisoner of Camp Rupert. Although the questions were all written by me, all words spoken by the interviewee were written by Fritz Graf in his story, An Outline of My Life. Today we have with us Fritz Graf. He was once a prisoner of Camp Rupert in Idaho. Fritz, why don't you tell us a little bit about your capture?
The end came quickly. On September 3rd, near the Belgian border, we were once again surrounded by English and American troops. Although I succeeded in breaking out of the pocket with a few soldiers during the night, the next morning, our little group came under fresh attack, this time from Belgian partisans on September 9th. We were handed over to the Americans.
How would you describe your journey to America?
In the officer's mess on the board, Thomas H. Berry, we were fed during the 12-day crossing like we never were before, sometimes with food which none of us have ever seen. Ham and eggs, corn flakes, turkey, ice cream, and real ground coffee.
Fascinating. Which camp did you arrive at once you reached the United States?
On the 20th, we arrived at the Dermot camp in Arkansas. I was now at POW 31G 17492.
And what was that like?
The whole atmosphere was peaceful, and only rarely were there any incidents to speak of.
Germany capitulated on May 8th, 1945. What happened then?
Our rations got smaller and smaller. We all drink except water was withdrawn except for 1 cup of coffee. 3 times a day at the same time, a propaganda campaign was launched with the slogan, in America, do not work and you get nothing to eat.
Because of this campaign, German prisoners of war were pressured into finding work. How did you go about finding work, Fritz?
We were made to sign a form which began with the words, I request paid work of any kind. On October 1st, 1945, a heavily guarded train brought us from Dermot in Arkansas to Rupert, Idaho. On the very first day after our arrival, we were divided into groups, loaded into lorries, and taken to farms where we had to dig potatoes or reap sugar beets.
So now you were in Camp Rupert, correct? So how were the conditions there? What was it like?
The journey from camp to farm were frequently long, and so we were often woken up as early as 4 o'clock in the morning to return only at 8 or 9 o'clock at night. Days missed because of rain had to be caught up on Sundays, and such free Sundays as we did have were taken up in restoring our torn and dirty clothing.
So how much were you getting paid in Rupert?
For our work, we were only paid 80 cents a day, but only if the task was 100% finished, which it never was.
What was food like? Can you describe it for us?
The food was good, and we were also given sandwiches to take with us to work. The farmers usually gave us something extra to eat or drink, though this was strictly speaking forbidden.
Were you ever moved to any of the branch camps under Rupert?
For some time, I was in a branch camp in Idaho Falls, where the atmosphere was particularly informal and unmilitary, and where the fence around the camp was no more than a grazing enclosure.
How was work in the winter? Were you still going out into the fields despite the snow?
Snow and frost put an end to our work on November 30th, as I found it rather tiresome with nothing to do in our overcrowded barracks. I made friends with a fellow prisoner who spent his time at the mess room table repairing watches for the other POWs. From practically nothing, we gradually made the tools we needed, and then we moved on to more and more sophisticated repair jobs, all, of course, without spare parts.
So what did you do with this skill? Did the American Guards ever try to shut down your business?
With practice, we got quite skilled, and eventually even the American officers brought us their watches to be repaired. With special written permission from the camp commander, we were able on release to take our tools back home with us.
It seems you had a good life in Camp Rupert for the most part. How was morale?
Christmas came around for the second time in captivity, despite good food, cakes, and punch. The mood was very, very gloomy, for we had hoped that this time we would be able to celebrate Christmas with our families. The papers gave depressing news of Germany, and most of us had no contact at all with our relatives.
Interesting. I'm sorry to hear that. You were soon promised to be released from Camp Rupert, but there was another disappointment coming your way. Can you tell us about that?
All the greater was to our disappointment, we were taken away to various new camps in France. I was taken to a camp at Autrechet, north of Paris. The worst I've ever seen, and for time being, there could no longer be any question of release.
In French camps such as the one you were in, strong men were picked out to work in fields. Others were interviewed, and if they were found to be Nazis, they were punished and put into camps. You were part of the group that made it back home to Germany. Is that correct?
On March 14th, 1946, I was released in Heilbronn, and on the 15th, I was able to take my mother in my arms. I learned that my father had already been dead for almost a year, having died in the belief that I had been killed.
That is unfortunate. Fritz, thank you for taking the time out of your day to tell us about your experience in Camp Rupert. This concludes the interview. Now that we're done with the interview, let's discuss some of the ethical dilemmas that came up when talking about Camp Rupert. The first one is, why did we treat German POWs so much better than our own Japanese American POWs who were innocent? The way I understood it, it was out of practicality. The US government was trying to protect our own troops who were in foreign camps by treating German POWs well. Since the Japanese Americans in our camps were mostly citizens of our own nation, there was no outside threat. This, to me, seems to prioritize self-preservation over justice. If justice were a priority, Japanese Americans would have been treated better than the German POWs, or never imprisoned in the first place. This brings us to our next ethical question. Why were American citizens so quick to separate German people from their government, but could not do the same for Japanese citizens? Did German prisoners deserve the punishment they got? Was it too harsh, or was it too easygoing? Should we have separated the hardcore Nazis from the people who simply got roped into the military? After all, many men did not know what they were getting into or were forced into the military. I think these are all questions that circle back to justice. It is impossible to know every individual person's story and whether or not they deserve the punishments they got. Sometimes choices were made where innocent people were punished or where evil goes unpunished. This is not ideal, but I think it is realistic to the time. And on the topic of German POW treatment, another ethical issue that arises is how our treatment of prisoners affects our own troops. Was it fair for us to treat our prisoners as well as we did only for the purpose of protecting our own troops and not to uphold the dignity of German POWs as human beings? I think that even though the motivation may sound a little selfish on paper, it resulted in more soldiers being treated humanely than if the United States hadn't done anything to begin with. I think my experience at Camp Rupert was a little mixed. After it closed, most pieces of the camp were auctioned off, and today it is an empty field that continues to be used for farming and agriculture. At first, I was of the opinion that we went too easy on prisoners, especially since in my mind they were all one-dimensional Nazis, and I saw them as villains. As I did more research, especially regarding the primary sources and first-hand accounts of men such as Fritz Graf and Werner Schultz, my opinion started to change. I saw the POWs as more complete human beings and saw many of them as victims. When I was reading Werner Schultz's story, I was faced with the idea that it was common for German men to be manipulated into joining the military, sometimes even forced to. I do not think it was fair for them to be forced into camps, even if Rupert was a generally desirable place to be. Despite it not being fair, I also think it was unavoidable. I think the biggest thing I got out of this project was to continue to humanize history and to be open to perspectives that may not necessarily be popular regarding historical places or events. Looking at things through different ethical and personal perspectives seems like a more complete way to study history to me. I believe empathy has a big role to play in his studying history. Another important lens to look at history through is also preservation. Preserving history is something that didn't really happen regarding Camp Rupert. Because all the buildings were auctioned off or sold or repurposed, it isn't really kept track of very well, and most Idahoans don't know it even happened in the first place. I think preserving history is really important and something I really got out of this project.